The night in Jerusalem was intense. Easter had drawn people from all over the region, and the city was lit up with lamps, torches, and a multitude gathered in the temple. But in a modest room, something unusual was happening, something that would change the destiny of all humanity. Jesus, with a calm yet heavy expression, looked at his disciples around the table. He knew this would be his last supper with them. Every word, every gesture was filled with immense love and deep sadness, for he knew what was to come: betrayal, suffering, and the weight of the world's sins upon himself. Yet, his heart was not gripped by fear, but with the resolve to fulfill the purpose for which he was born. It was Easter in Jerusalem. Jesus and his 12 disciples gathered for something only he knew. It would be their last meal together. The disciples were still confused. The last days, Jesus' words had been cryptic, as if something dark and inevitable was approaching. He spoke of suffering and an imminent sacrifice, but they couldn't fully understand. Now, sitting around the table for the Easter celebration, Jesus looked at them deeply, as if to imprint each of their faces into his memory. He broke the bread with solemn care and distributed it among them. But as he did, he spoke words that left them bewildered. "This is my body given for you." His voice was calm, but there was a hint of sadness. Then he lifted the cup of wine, looked at them, and declared, "This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, poured out for many." The disciples exchanged glances, trying to understand what he meant, but the weight of his words began to sink in. Something changed in the air, and Jesus was saying goodbye. During the meal, he told the disciples that he would be betrayed by one of them. The disciples grew anxious, seeking answers in each other's eyes. When asked, Jesus didn't hesitate. It was Judas, his friend and follower, who would betray him. Judas felt a shiver, but trying to hide his guilt, hurried to leave. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hall, and a heavy atmosphere fell over the group, as if something dark had settled in. It was the beginning of the end. Before we continue, I would kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel so that we can spread the Creator's message to even more people. Thank you. After the meal, Jesus asked his disciples to accompany him to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place he often went to pray. Upon arriving in the garden amidst the olive trees, Jesus seemed more troubled and weary than ever. He asked the disciples to pray with him, then stepped a few feet away to pray alone. Kneeling on the cold earth, he began to sweat drops of blood. Such was his anguish. He knew what lay ahead: the pain, the humiliation, the separation from the Father. In his prayer he murmured, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." But soon after, with supernatural strength, he added, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Returning to the disciples, he found them asleep, unable to resist the fatigue. Though he understood human weakness, he felt alone. They couldn't comprehend the burden he bore, couldn't share in the agony consuming his soul. In the distance, through the shadows, he saw the glow of torches approaching. The betrayal was taking form. Judas appeared, leading a group of soldiers and guards, and approached Jesus with a cold expression. The man who had once called him friend was now there to hand him over. With a kiss on Jesus' cheek, Judas sealed the betrayal. Jesus looked at him with compassion and asked, "Friend, are you betraying me with a kiss?" Judas, unable to hold his gaze, turned away, while the soldiers stepped forward and seized Jesus. Peter, in a burst of anger, drew his sword and struck one of the guards, cutting off his ear. But Jesus, even amidst betrayal and violence, raised his hand and healed the injured man. The act puzzled the soldiers, but he knew he was there to fulfill his mission. "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword," he said, resigned. Taken into custody, Jesus was dragged to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court where he would be judged. The priests and religious leaders waited for him, eager to condemn him. The accusations were many. He had proclaimed himself the Son of God, challenged their authority, and drawn crowds with promises of a heavenly kingdom. Even in the face of furious accusations, Jesus remained mostly silent, looking at them with an incomprehensible calm. When directly asked if he was the Son of God, he answered, "You have said it." This response was enough for the religious leaders to deem him worthy of death. But the Jews, lacking the legal power to order an execution, took Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate, a pragmatic and skeptical man, found no fault in Jesus. As he questioned the calm and battered man, he was intrigued, as if he were witnessing something far greater. He asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate was unsettled, but felt the pressure from the crowd waiting outside. He attempted to release Jesus by offering the people a choice. As was the custom at Easter, he would release a prisoner, and he offered Jesus as an option. But the crowd, urged by the religious leaders, chose to free Barabbas, a criminal. Shouting, they demanded Jesus be crucified. Reluctant and pressured, Pilate gave in to the crowd's demands. He washed his hands, signifying that he would not take responsibility for what was about to happen. He handed Jesus over to the soldiers. The Roman soldiers took him to the courtyard and began the torture. The scourging was done with a leather whip embedded with metal and bone pieces that tore his skin and muscles with each strike. Jesus endured silently, each blow weakening him further. When the soldiers finished, they draped a purple robe over him, a color associated with royalty, and wove a crown of thorns, which they cruelly pressed onto his head. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they mocked, laughing and spitting. Yet Jesus didn't respond. He bore it all with a serenity that only deepened the mystery around him. Finally, the order for crucifixion was given, and Jesus received the cross he was to carry to Golgotha. Exhausted and torn by the torture, he stumbled with each step, staggering under the weight of the wood. Along the way, a man named Simon of Cyrene was forced to help carry the cross as Jesus was close to collapse. The crowd followed crying, and women lamented for him, but in his compassion Jesus warned them, "Do not cry for me, but for yourselves and your children." Even in agony, he continued to think of others. At Golgotha, Jesus was stripped of his clothes, and the soldiers laid him on the cross. They nailed his wrists and feet to the wood, each hammer blow echoing through the hill. The pain was indescribable. Each movement intensified his suffering as his body was stretched and brutally secured. They raised the cross and set it in the ground, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth, vulnerable and exposed. On the cross, Jesus still found strength to forgive. Looking at the soldiers and the crowd, he called to the Father, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." His words of compassion impacted those around. Even some soldiers, witnesses to many executions, were unsettled by his calm and mercy beyond understanding. Beside him, 2 thieves were also crucified. One mocked him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, recognizing who Jesus was, humbly pleaded, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, with a look of tenderness, replied, "Today you will be with me in heaven." Even in his dying moments, he offered hope to those who sought forgiveness. At noon, a supernatural darkness covered the land, as if the universe itself were rebelling against the injustice of that death. The sky darkened and the silence was harrowing. Jesus, sensing the end approaching, cried out in agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was the weight of all humanity's sins that fell upon him, a burden so immense that it momentarily separated him from the Father. At last, exhausted and consumed by pain, Jesus murmured the words that would seal the purpose of his mission, "It is finished." With a final breath, he gave up his spirit. As he exhaled for the last time, the earth shook, and the temple veil, the symbol of separation between God and humanity, was torn from top to bottom. This marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new covenant. The soldiers, standing there both amazed and afraid, They knew this man was the Son of God. Jesus' lifeless body was taken down from the cross by Joseph of Arimathea, an influential man who was also his follower in secret. He and Nicodemus, another disciple, wrapped Jesus' body in fine linen and placed it in a new tomb, carved out of rock. A large stone sealed the entrance, and soldiers were stationed to guard it, to prevent anyone from trying to take the body. For the disciples and followers, it seemed like the end. The one they believed to be the Messiah was dead, and their hopes were buried with him. 3 days after Jesus' death, at dawn, something extraordinary happened. The stone sealing the tomb was rolled away, and his body was no longer there. The women who came to visit found the tomb empty, and with amazement and joy were told by an angel that he had risen. The grief and mourning of his followers turned into indescribable joy. What seemed like the end was revealed to be the beginning of a new, eternal hope. Jesus had conquered death, and the promise of salvation became real for all who believe.